Dr. Doreen Grand-Pichet is the
Dr. Doreen is an expert in autism.
Doreen Grand-Pichet.
Dr. Grand-Pichet.
Dr. Doreen Grand-Pichet.
Dr. Doreen Grand-Pichet is a visionary in the field of autism. Now you can ask her questions on Ask Dr. Doreen. Welcome to Ask Dr. Doreen. We're here with Dr. Doreen Grand-Pichet. She is a true expert in the field of autism, been working in this field, shockingly, for 40 years. I still can't say that comfortably. She certainly doesn't look like it, let's say that. But working in this field of autism, working with very young children all the way up through senior citizens and everything in between, individuals who are mildly experiencing autism and those who are very profoundly affected.
Right.
And really, I say this all the time, you're a visionary in this field.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
You are somebody who has such compassion for all members of the autism community, the individual themselves. I think you do some of the best perspective taking I've not only experienced in my life, but seen, that you're able to look at things and say, what is it like for this individual? But also, what is it like for the siblings? What is it like for the family? What is it like for the caregivers? What is it like for the people who are delivering therapy? And to try to take care of everyone within that circle, which is a tough thing. But you've done a great job.
I tried. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it's, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully comprehend what it is like to be a parent. But it is the one that motivates me the most. So I'm all about trying to understand what the parents go through.
Well, I got to say, you get it better than anybody else
Thank
who doesn't
you.
have a child on the spectrum.
Thank you very much.
I think you get it better than I do sometimes.
No.
So, and for those of you who don't know, I am a very proud parent of a young man who was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2.5. There is a question that I'm going to get to eventually that somebody had said, you say your son is recovering from ASD. Are you saying that there's a cure? We're going to get to that. We're going to put that one on pause for a second.
That's a big question.
It is a big question, and it will take us a little while to get there. But first, we had a question that came in last week after, like right as we were ending, from a mom who's written to us a couple of times before. She and I had a little bit of a conversation after she wrote in this question, because I didn't want to make her wait an entire week for somebody to say something to her.
Of course.
But I just 3 seconds ago handed you the sort of back and forth that we've had going back. But while you're looking at that, I'm going to read the first part of the question.
Sure.
Hi, Shannon and Dr. Doreen. Hope you are both well. I wrote to you at the end of August concerning my son and his increasing anxiety. My son is 13 years old, has ASD, ADHD, and a learning disability. Last week, his consult has finally prescribed him 10 milligrams a day of fluoxetine, I always murder the names of the medicines, to try and help with his anxiety. I'm really hoping the medication helps give him a bit of ease. He's very vocal about his worries, and I'm trying to find ways to help him deal with these. School is very difficult for him as he's in a class that has very challenging children. The class is very unsettled, and he is so aware of others' feelings. He's exhausted when he gets home from school. He constantly needs reassurance from me and suffers from separation anxiety, especially from me. We have a worry plaque and a feelings journal, but we're constantly using these. I'm not sure if there's anything else I could be doing. I feel very helpless at the moment, and I'm worried about his mental health. And, you know, I had written back to her to say that we would put it at the top of the hour. And also to say, you know, I have been a classroom teacher for many years, and I have concerns always. If a classroom is a mess, and the person who's in charge of the classroom can't contain people's behaviors, everyone suffers. Absolutely everyone. And so, you know, that's a concern for me, and I'd written back to her about that. She wrote more about what some of her concerns are, which I don't think we need to necessarily share, but I wanted you to be able to see it. So what do you recommend for this 13-year-old boy and this mom who's so concerned about his anxiety?
Yeah, and I noticed that I just looked at the email and I think this is someone in England.
Ireland.
Ireland.
Ireland,
And
yeah.
so I don't know what the laws are in
Mhm.
Ireland in regards to school attendance.
Mhm.
But the first thing, when I read the situation, the very first thing, because she says, what else can I do? I would pull my child out of school immediately. Like, there's no way that I would expose my child to this because what is the downside? Like,
Yeah.
Short of someone coming and arresting me for truancy, I would pull my child out because
Yeah.
he's not going to. It's not worth it. The stress and anxiety that he's going through, the fear that is developing, it doesn't balance out with gains.
Mhm.
I don't know, first of all, that he's gaining anything. Even if he was gaining, I don't know that it's worth this anxiety. So I would pull him out until the district found me a better placement.
There you go.
That's what I would do. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so I've been to some classes that are like this, and believe me, it causes stress and anxiety for us. Like, forget about a child who might be also sensitive in terms of hearing or sound, or just fearful if there are other children who are aggressive or doing challenging screaming. I mean, imagine being in a classroom where there are other children who are completely out of control, screaming, perhaps the noise level, the activity level, it's just fear evoking.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's so difficult for parents to listen to their inner gut sometimes, because one of the things that she did write in the second email, that she described how when she leaves him at school,
Yeah.
she feels like she's driving away into the sunset and leaving him in this really
Horrible
environment, and it doesn't sit well with her.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so funny because I know I have had things like that happen as a parent where I've said, I'm not okay with this. I'm not.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to listen to that voice in yourself because you don't know
It's true.
when are you overreacting.
It's true.
But I love that you wrote in. I love that you heard that from the preeminent expert in autism, that she's saying, no, listen to yourself.
Absolutely.
And don't leave him there.
Undoubtedly. There's just no reason. There's
There we
no
go.
reason to expose him. I learned this lesson, or a much milder version of this lesson, many, many years ago. I had a child in school, and he was doing pretty well. He enjoyed school, actually. He because he was very smart and he enjoyed learning, but he had started to develop a pretty significant phobia about going from class to class, like moving in between. And we discovered that it had to do with the buzzer, the time, the buzzer that indicates that it's the end of a class session.
Yeah.
And it was so horrific for him that about 15 minutes prior to the buzzer, he would just completely start panicking.
Right.
Like, we're talking panic. And it's just, we ended up actually giving him headphones and he was fine. But the issue is that why force a child? Like, at first we tried to acclimate him to the sound, and we were like, this is too much for him.
Yeah.
Why force this child that we're trying to give him worry plaques and feeling journal, but a worry plaque and a feeling journal they're objects that have no value unless they gain some sense of peace, right? So he could write forever, but it's not going to help him avoid that anxiety-provoking situation. Or he could tell you that he's worried. It's not going to help him. The bottom line is he's going into, sort of from his perspective maybe, it's like entering a war zone.
Yeah.
So take him out.
There you go.
Take him out and have the school provide you with a better environment for him. Sometimes it's not about modifying the child's abilities, it's about modifying the environment sometimes.
There we go. Now, when he comes home, and she's probably going to have to homeschool for a little while they find a placement, what kinds of things could she be doing to work on the anxiety there?
I think that probably the anxiety would not occur there, but would occur when you find another placement. Okay. So what'll probably happen is that you won't be dealing with this sort of stuff at home, because it sounds like it's more school-based. If it is home-based, then please let us know and we'll address that. But what'll happen is when you start to go back to a new school, he won't trust anyone because he'll think you're going to a bad environment. And what I would do in that case is I would stay with him for a little while until he realizes that I'd fade myself out gradually until he realizes that the new school environment is not the same as the old one. It's a much easier type of environment. That's all. I mean, like, you know, our children react normally. There's nothing about we have to listen to their reactions. That's a very normal reaction. Any child would be upset if they're in a classroom where people are out of control.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why it so concerns me that a lot of times schools will say, well, we need to put all the kids with autism and everything else together.
That's right.
You know, we're going to segregate them all together, put them in some place. And for a lot of our kids who are sensory sensitive, you know, being with somebody who's sitting next to somebody who does this is enough to put them into a place where they want to crawl out into a ball. It doesn't necessarily work putting them together.
Absolutely.
I don't know who came up with that great idea. Let's put them all together.
Exactly. It's completely like counterintuitive. The other, even if they're not sensory sensitive, someone who sits next to you and does this all day is distracting.
Yeah.
So, you know, not the fault of the child who's doing this, but the bottom line is that is why ABA is and has always been one-to-one. So the concept has to be that for a child with autism, so forget about everybody else, but that child who's hand flapping needs a one-to-one, and they need a different environment altogether, because believe me, even that child who's hand flapping is going to be distracted and upset when there's another child screaming, and the child who's screaming is going to be distracted and upset by the child who's they're all going to cause chaos, and you know, with each other's sensory abilities or sensitivities, and distracted. And so the whole purpose of going to school is to learn. Like, you are not going to be learning. I mean, you know, it's not a camp where we throw our kids in and hope that someone's going to take care of them. That's not going to happen.
When our son was first diagnosed with autism, he was 2.5, and California offered us this sort of floor time-esque thing. And we went and were doing it, and everybody had said how, you know, how great it was and how it's kid-driven.
Really? Oh,
and
the
all.
school staff.
Well, the people at the regional center were like, oh, you're going to love this, you're going to love this. So we took Jem, and we had such high hopes. He had stopped speaking, and we thought, this is something. We're going to get something. And it was a nightmare for him. It was an absolute nightmare for him. They would let the kids run around in this play gym for a little while, and always what would happen, Jem wouldn't play with anybody else, but at some point he made a lot of noises. He would go, he would grunt, and then one little girl would scream and go, monster, and then Jem thought it was great. He would chase after the kids while they would yell monster.
Oh my
I was horrified, and they thought it was great because he's interacting, and I was like, interacting? The other kids, these are kids with autism and Down syndrome and other developmental things, and they were screaming and running away from him. So this was horrifying. Then they would take him into a room that they would call the music room, and they had all the primary plastic colored chairs and they would sit there and they would put on this recording of somebody singing this, you know, different ABC song, and then the teacher would sit in front of them, and she would have all these little, they would, you know, A is for apple, and she would sign apple, and all the other kids sat there in the circle and they would sign these things, and Jem would scream and run for the door. And now the kids had behaviors going on while they were singing, but he would scream and run for the door, and like he was in pain, he would scream. And if you tried to bring him back, he'd claw and bite and kick. He did not want to be in there. And every day was a nightmare. Every single time my husband, they showed us how to hold him in a basket hold. So we would have him in a basket hold while the other kids were doing it. Then they said, well, we just need to put him in a weighted vest. So he was in a weighted vest, and we were doing the basket hold, and he'd scream and claw. I had claw marks on my neck where he would try to get out, right? And then they said, well, we'll put him in a 5-point harness therapy chair. So he was in the weighted vest, in the and we would have our arms around him past that, because he would tip the chair over, get it on its side, and be clawing and kicking his way out. So then they said, let's put a weighted blanket over. And I said, why don't you just staple him to the floor?
That's crazy.
Right? It was horrifying. But we would be, and this would last like 40 minutes, and then they would have a craft and a snack. And I would always come out of there crying, and the other parents looking at us, and eventually the other parents asked that we be taken out of the group because he was so disruptive, right? But then before we got to that, though, it was spring break. And one of the other little boys had an older brother who was 5 in typical kindergarten, and he came to because, what was she going to do? Leave him at home? It was spring break. And he came in and sat down in a chair and no behaviors. And so Jem took one look at him and went over and sat down right next to him and was like looking at what he was doing. And the other boy had his hands like on his knees. And so Jem put his hands on his knees and was watching. And Jem sat there and signed through the whole thing like a magic trick. And I said, what just happened? And it was because he had someone to model that wasn't having a whole lot of other stuff to deal with.
Yeah.
And that's when I went, oh, no. And went on the look for other things and eventually miraculously found Card through really
How
cool
long did this go on? Like, how long was this process?
So we started in January, and they had us in this process until June. And then right after his birthday, his 3rd birthday, we started with Card.
That's amazing.
And he had nothing, no gains in that 6 months. But I was beaten and bruised.
Unbelievable.
And then we started with Card, and it was miraculous. It was
the change.
And the change, I mean, what happened in that first year, I've written blogs about it, about what a difference a year can make. School, by the way, wanted him to go to school. And when they showed us the IEP, what they wanted to do in that year, the one thing that he could do was that he could sort the little colored bears by colors. That's what he could do. And his whole IEP was about that he would be able to sort in colors. And I said to them, there's nothing on here that he's going to gain. Where are the things? And they said, well, he's not capable of doing these things in a group sitting. When he's with other kids, he screams. And so we have to work on getting him to be able to do what he already knows. And I said, so you're going to torture him for a year?
Yeah.
And that's what you're going to do? And we fought. We fought hard. I mean, I told you last week they sued us because I said, we're not doing that. We want him to grow and progress. And we fought for and were able to do a 40-hour in-home program because that was all you had back then. 40 hours of Card in the home. I now know what we could have accomplished in that year if we'd had the center, that we could have gotten even more. But, what we got done was miraculous.
Yeah, that's incredible. What
a year later, they had someone who didn't know him evaluate him after a year of Card. So she didn't look at the previous report, and she offered him full inclusion, and he was included ever after that. After 1 year of intensive Card, he didn't scream when he was around other kids after that. He loved being around other kids.
You just gave me goosebumps. Like, I'm horrified. Like the stories you were saying about, like, like putting him in a harness and all that sort of stuff. It just horrifies me that this sort of stuff would have happened just a few years ago. Like, I remember going to court for a family, because all the 90s was just about going to court. Like, I was an expert witness every week. And so I remember going to court for a family where the child had been kind of like strapped down in order to be taught. And I remember thinking, like, this is so barbaric. Like, how does this even happen in this century? And to hear that 20 years fast forward, it still is happening, is just crazy to me.
And to my kid, who is doing amazing things now.
Who's like such an intelligent kid, unbelievable.
And as a teacher, I kept saying, it seems like there's something else going on. Why aren't we addressing that?
Yes.
Because he's not going to learn until we get that under control. But when I saw him sit next to that kid who was not having all these issues, man, that was it for me. I was like, I'm not putting him in a room where he has, because whatever, and we hadn't really been paying attention to how much noise, because there was more noise coming out of my kid than out of anybody else.
Yes.
So that's all I was focused on.
Of course.
But then to sit back and go, this is a chaotic thing. These kids have things going on.
Yes.
No wonder why he's screaming and in pain and whatever. Anyway, we should take a break, and then maybe we can come back and answer this question about my son is recovering from ASD.
Yeah.
You use the word cure. It's incendiary. So we'll address that in just a second. So stick with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Autism Live and to Ask Dr. Doreen. We're here with Dr. Doreen Grant-Pichet, and she's answering your questions in real time. And we had a question that I teased before that somebody wrote in and said, you say your son is recovering from ASD, and are you saying that there is a cure? First of all, you must have read that on our website because it was part of my bio on the old website. That there's been such a, I don't know, an arc. When our son was first diagnosed, we were using the word autistic. So we were saying to people, he's autistic. And I have to tell you, it didn't feel right. And I said to my husband, this doesn't feel right. Then we happened to turn on Oprah one day, and Holly Robinson Peete and Jenny McCarthy were on the show talking about their children with autism. So eye-opening to me, right? And Holly Robinson Peete said, we don't use the word autistic referring to our son because when somebody has cerebral palsy, you don't call them palsic. You don't define them by the thing. So she said, we say he has autism. But it wasn't autism spectrum disorder back then. It was just autism. We say he has autism. And I said to Jim, my husband, I said, I like that better. He is not autism. He is separate in my mind. That at the time I said he's separate from autism, so we're going to say he has autism. Then we started at CARD, and I said it doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't fit. It's not the hopeful that I want to be. And we started saying that he's actively recovering from autism. That became the thing that we said all the time. Well, now my son is 15, and he gets to pick and choose some of the words that are used. And I find it interesting because I always ask him, how do you want me to say this? What do you want me to say? And his thing is, I don't have a problem if you say to people that I was diagnosed with autism at 2.5. And he goes, but that should be the end of the discussion.
Yeah, I love that. Because
he does not identify himself as being on the autism spectrum.
No, and he isn't. I mean, and that is the big thing that people need to realize. So, are you ready for a long discussion on
to wrap
this?
in?
I just always
right, and look, spoiler alert here. Somebody's going to be offended, right?
I hope not. I mean, I'm going to be very scientific and neutral about this. So, so let's just, there's the emotional side of it. So I have so many things to say about this.
Yeah.
But let me just start with a very important portion of it, and then I'll put my own feelings on it as well. So let's say, I'm trying to think of another disorder that we could talk, another mental disorder that we, let's say, dysgraphia or whatever, any kind of disorder that it's defined by a series of symptoms, right? So we'll say, obsessive compulsive disorder. That's a good one. Everybody knows about OCD. An obsessive compulsive disorder has a series of symptoms, right? And you diagnose someone not by saying, oh, he seems to have it, or he was born with it, or something like that, but you will sit with the patient and you'll observe and you'll ask questions and you'll identify symptoms that are causing such a problem for the individual that the individual is there to seek help. And the symptoms are, with OCD, there are things like repetitive compulsive behaviors and et cetera, anxiety about a certain thing and so on. And you list these symptoms, right? And you write, oh, he has this, and it's severe enough that it's causing him distress, et cetera, et cetera. And you list them, and if there's, let's say, 5, and the symptom requirements in the diagnostic manual are 6, you don't get that diagnosis. Right. It's just very simple. If they're 5 and they're not severe enough, you're not going to get the diagnosis. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so they wouldn't say that you're OCD because that's obsessive compulsive disorder. But what would you say if you had 4 and it needed 5? What would you say? That you have some elements of OCD, or how would you language it?
It wouldn't be necessary to say that. You would express the symptoms that you have.
Okay, so you have anxiety.
You would say this individual has a certain amount of, is anxious about things.
Okay.
You can't even say they have anxiety because anxiety is a disorder.
Okay.
You would say they have anxiety about certain things.
Okay.
Or there are some compulsive behaviors present. They're just not enough to classify for that diagnosis.
Disorder.
So now let's talk about autism,
Okay.
right? So autism has a series of symptoms that must be present in order for you to get that diagnosis. So in the old days, it was very interesting because you would have you had 3 sets, right, of behaviors. You had, and when I say old days, I'm talking about prior to 2013, you know, or 2015.
Way
really.
way back, yeah.
Way back. If I want to really go way back, like we're talking DSM-3, that was a whole different set of diagnostic criteria. That's the one I originally trained on. And it's like 16 different symptoms that had to be present. Then DSM-4 changed that to 3 sets. And within each set, you had to have like 2 or 3 symptoms present. They just kind of subdivided it. And it was an interesting era because sometimes you'd see kids and they would have enough symptoms in sections 1 and 2, which was communication and social, but not in section 3, which was self-stimulatory repetitive behaviors. And the same thing holds true today. So you look at a child right now that those domains dropped into 2, right? And it became social communication, and the other one is sort of the repetitive areas, or it's not really repetitive because it also includes sensory in there. But nevertheless, you still need to have all of these and a few of these. And if you don't, I'm not going to be able to give you a diagnosis at all. Now, there's enough now where most of the time when I see a child, you will fit to some extent, but now I have the ability to also give you a severity level, which essentially means like you could have a child who is extremely mild on the spectrum and they need a little bit of help. And you have a child who's very severe and they need a lot of help. And also I can say they really need a lot of help in the social communication area, but they don't have a lot of self-stimulatory, so they don't need a lot of help in that area. You know, so we have options now.
Yeah.
But having said that, if I have a child, even right now, who, let's say, and I'm now going to describe, and maybe you'll recognize this, who, let's say, prefers to have less active social life, so like more of a one-on-one friendships rather than, is not the social butterfly type, right? You know, all of my kids, right? So I'm kind of like not Nikki, not Charlie, but more Nikki, right?
Okay.
They're very different.
Right.
So there's a child who's less, like their friendships are much more one-on-one rather than group. Let's say it's a child who prefers to read alone rather than go out and party with friends. It's an individual who maybe even doesn't really enjoy noisy environments, has problems with noisy environments, so will avoid noisy environments. Let's say they are also disturbed by chaos and intensive lights and maybe going into chaotic environments like the previous one we're discussing will cause anxiety for this individual and all of those types of things, right? So maybe they're not even, because they've been isolated or not in social environments their whole life, they might not read social nuances just as well as other people. But you know what? I'm sorry, even with all of that, they just will not get the diagnosis because they don't have enough of the symptoms. So Jem, as an example, just doesn't have enough of the symptoms. He just doesn't. He may still struggle with certain environments, but there is no way on earth anyone would ever diagnose him on this spectrum, ever, right now. So the difficulties that he himself, and I don't know if he does or doesn't have, but any child might still have a couple of areas where they need assistance. That's normal.
Yeah.
It's like any other child. Like any child who never received a diagnosis might come and say, you know what, I have a really hard time in a classroom that's really noisy. I can't focus on this. Or I don't really know what my friends mean when they say these types of things. Or like they could have individual symptoms, right? But that we also include or not, but they have nothing really to do with autism. So when you have a child, when I get a child and I am, they start out with all 20 symptoms, and over the course of intervention, they no longer have enough symptoms to be diagnosed. They are done with this diagnosis. Now you can call it whatever is less offensive, because I am not a parent. I don't know what terminology is offensive or isn't. But to me, it's just the same as saying someone might have chickenpox and they'll have scars left from the chickenpox, but they no longer have chickenpox. It is over for them. They don't struggle with it anymore. It is not something that I can say they have actively. And it's the same thing. You could say it's autism in remission if that's how you feel more comfortable. But the bottom line is, if a completely neutral psychiatrist, psychologist, diagnostician saw them, they would no longer classify them under that criteria. That's, and I don't, so yes, it is possible to drop the diagnosis. And I refer to that as recovery. There's nothing, there's never has been, ever, in the history of all time, any kind of negative connotation with that. I know that parents sometimes, or even individuals on the spectrum.
I think it's more individuals on the spectrum get upset. Yeah.
They get upset because they feel like we're saying autism is a bad thing and now you have recovered from it.
Yeah.
Well, bottom line is, the truth is, anything that is classified as a disorder, and it means by definition that the symptoms of that thing have made life harder for you, period. If you were in a planet where everyone had the same symptoms, life would not be harder, because all of life would have been modeled to fit individual. But the truth is, life is not modeled for, the world is not modeled for individuals on the spectrum. You will go to places where others expect you to communicate at a certain level. You will go to environments that are harsh for you, sensory-wise. There are a million things that your life becomes more difficult. And when the definition of a disorder, by the way, is anything that prevents you from functioning like others at work, at school, at home.
Yeah.
So, the example that I've always said is like, someone could drink a bottle of scotch a day, and as long as they go to work and have a functioning, great work environment, do well at work, and they have a good family life, you cannot be diagnosed with alcohol disorder or even dependence, because you basically are functioning.
Right.
And that's the key issue here. It's that autism is so pervasive that it prevents you from enjoying or being able to, access the various reinforcers in a normal world. And so as a result of that, it is classified as a disorder. Yeah. And so when you no longer struggle with it, in the sense that you do not have enough symptoms that prevent you from functioning and even succeeding in school, with friends, and at home, in a work life, then you don't have it. You don't have a disorder.
I think part of the issue is that, and I love the definition that you just gave, because that's the clinical definition.
Yes.
But emotions always come into it. And there is a culture of autism now, too.
Yes.
And the culture of autism, and the more I meet and talk with adults who are on the autism spectrum, and how they identify with themselves, and how they, in a time when the world did not have a positive outlook on autism, they sort of banded together like,
protection.
Like penguins in a snowstorm. They
Protection.
circled the wagons and they said, Temple calls herself an autistic. Mm-hmm. That's like the oldest generation of people with autism. I am an autistic. That's how much through and through they relate to being autism. Then a little bit older,
it's like saying I'm a woman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is how they identify, and they're very protective of it. And
Yes.
they have come to understand that their brains are wired differently.
Correct.
And they are protective of that, and they are angry sometimes when I certainly have suggested to my son and to other people, well, look, this is the way I need you to do it. And they will say, why? Mm-hmm. Is that just because you and a bunch of people like you decided? And boy, that's very enlightening to me, because it's like, yeah, why do we do it this way? Because
Mm-hmm.
there are more of us than there are of you. But you see that that's changing. That
That's
there
definitely
changing. And the world is changing to be in ways that are more accommodating of that different wiring.
Definitely, no question. But some basic things will never change.
Exactly.
And one of those is language.
Yeah.
Like humanity, and the whole difference between us and animals is that we communicate. And so being able to communicate appropriately is not going to, it's going to be something that is always a requirement of fitting into the universe, right?
And I want to say, when you say appropriately, what I hear is effectively.
Effectively, yes, effectively would be the same, I guess. When I say appropriately, I mean speaking
Yeah.
as opposed to hitting.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one of the difficulties becomes because there is this feeling of we are autistic and we need to protect that, and all of you are trying to get rid of what we are.
Yes.
And that there is this fear of that by getting rid of the disorder that
You're
you will get
changing
rid
me.
of, you're changing me and you will get rid of my culture. But the truth is that that individuals with autism are wired differently.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is still wired differently.
Mm-hmm.
He just doesn't have a disorder.
Mm-hmm,
And if
that's
we
right.
could get all individuals who are wired differently to have all obstacles that are in their way taken out, that difference, we see more and more of it all the time, shines.
But can I just stop for a second?
Yeah.
There is no if. We are all wired differently.
Well, but there is a very specific thing that I think, no.
It's just gradients. It's
just
just
gradients.
levels.
Well, that
We're
makes
completely wired differently.
Yeah.
Like, you just told me today that you have dizziness.
Oh, yeah.
That's you.
Yeah.
I don't get that.
Yeah.
I have other issues. I have back problems, right? We
Sure.
all have
Yeah.
things we struggle with.
Yes.
They're just not so. If I, for instance, let's say mentally, that's just from a perspective of like if I had so much anxiety,
Yeah.
which by the way is a very common symptom, if I had so much anxiety that it prevented me from doing things, would I band together with other very anxious people and say, leave us alone?
Right.
Or
We're
would
protecting
I say,
this 'cause we're different.
protecting it because it's part of us?
Right.
Or would I say, I need to kind of get over my anxiety so that I can go to work?
Right. Right.
And that's what this is about. This is
But
about.
it became about the words. I wish we would come up with different words. I wish we would get rid of, just give everybody that feels that way the term autism, and I wish they would come up with a new thing for the autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
And disassociate autism from disorder.
Yes.
Because they feel that they own that term. Yeah. I wish we would move another way.
And
because the fact that it's both of them,
Right.
it makes it very difficult for people emotionally.
Understood. And I just don't think that there is a way to get away from the word disorder. I think it's important to have the word disorder.
Oh, I think there needs to be the disorder. But let's take autism
is a
out
bad
of it.
word.
Let's call it, hedging green syndrome.
Yes.
Or hedging green disorder, right? Hedging green disorder, formerly known as autism spectrum disorder, and then we'll talk about autism and all the pluses that autism comes, and not the disorder parts that come with it.
Yeah.
That's hedging green.
No, it could be like social communication stereotypical disorder or something.
Oh, I want something out
right?
there.
But, so yeah, hedging green, so it doesn't. But the issue, I think and why it's important to have, of course, the term disorder is that it opens the door to a million other things.
You won't get any
support,
services.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. But honestly, to me, it's just it is important to. Maybe the way to refer to it instead of like saying recovery or cure or so on is to say just that it's overcoming the symptoms.
Yeah.
That's really all it is. It's overcoming the symptoms, or it's getting control over the symptoms. However you want to talk, however you want to say it, but it's. The symptoms are what make it debilitating. I always, when I do diagnosis with a parent, I always start by telling them the diagnosis itself doesn't matter at all, should not scare you, because I know that it's one of the most scary things to get a diagnosis. Yeah. And I tell people, don't think of it that way because it's completely malleable. It's going to change.
Yeah.
And in the old days when we had 3 or 4 different versions of the diagnosis, you'd have a child who would start with autism or autistic disorder, go to, let's say, pervasive developmental disorder, and then go to Asperger's, and then go to ADHD, and then nothing, right? Because they were shedding these symptoms as they went along. And so that is kind of how I still see it. I still see it as just a series of issues that we need to work on. Some of these issues require just intensive tutoring. It's just like someone saying, oh, my math is terrible, I need help with math. But my, creative writing is so incredible that I could help you,
I have to stop you because we're out of
We're
time.
out of
I have to
time.
let you
Okay,
go.
sorry.
I'm actually a minute late. So
Thank
we're
you.
going to take a break. We're going to excuse Dr. Granpichet. I'm going to be back to continue talking about some of the things that you guys wrote in that I can address, not of a clinical nature. And then it's going to be time for Let's Talk Autism with Shannon and Nancy, but stick